All right, let's dive into Rework today.
Hmm.
It's a guide
Okay.
that's pretty unconventional when it comes to business,
All right.
and it's by Jason Fried and David Heinemeier Hansson.
Right.
You might know them.
Huh?
They're the minds behind the company,
Uh,
37 Signals.
okay.
This book, though, it's not just aimed at, like,
Gotcha.
seasoned entrepreneurs or anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's really for anybody
Yeah.
who has felt that little entrepreneurial itch,
Yeah.
even if it's just a whisper while you're going through your daily routine.
I see.
So get ready, because we're going to uncover
Sure.
some insights that really challenge that
Yeah.
traditional way of thinking about business.
It really is remarkable how this book
Yeah.
manages to connect with such a wide range of people.
Right.
You know, from those seasoned business owners
Uh-huh.
to those who just have that
Yeah.
little inkling of an idea for a side hustle.
Okay.
Rework offers a fresh and often contrarian perspective
Yeah.
on how to approach
Work and business.
One of the first things that
Yeah.
really jumped out at me when I was reading this,
Okay.
how they kind of dismantled this real world argument.
Oh, yeah.
You know that phrase that people use to
Wow.
dismiss new ideas because they say, oh, that's not practical.
Yeah.
That's too idealistic for the real world.
It's like a shield almost.
It is.
That people use to protect themselves
Right.
from having to really consider new ideas.
Right. And it can almost become like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Absolutely it is.
If you're constantly told something won't work in the real world,
Uh-huh.
you're probably not going to even try it.
It's fascinating how
Yeah.
clinging to the familiar
Right.
can actually stifle progress.
Hmm.
The authors use a compelling analogy.
Okay.
They talk about a prisoner crafting tools
Okay.
from very limited
I
resources
see.
to illustrate how constraints can actually
Yeah.
spark creativity.
Hmm.
Or imagine Shakespeare,
Flourishing within the strict structure of a sonnet.
Right.
So it makes you wonder if sometimes those limitations are what force us to think differently, to
Sure.
find unique solutions.
I like that a lot.
It's a powerful concept
It really is.
to consider.
And it challenges that idea that we need
Hmm.
a ton of resources to be successful.
Absolutely.
Speaking of limitations,
Yeah.
they also address the whole idea of long-term planning,
Right.
which,
Yeah.
can sometimes feel like
Yeah.
you're just trying to predict the future,
It is a bit like that.
and it can be very uncertain.
Absolutely.
They boldly state that planning is guessing,
They do.
emphasizing that you never really know what's going to happen years in advance.
And that's a key insight
Yeah.
from the book.
It is.
They're not saying don't plan at all,
Right.
but rather
Mm.
don't get so caught up in elaborate long-term plans that you lose sight of the need to adapt and improvise
Okay.
as circumstances change.
So it's more about being flexible
It is.
than trying to stick to
Yeah,
a rigid plan that might be outdated.
exactly. It's a bit like overpacking for a trip.
Okay.
Sometimes it's better to pack light
Right.
and pick up what you need along the way.
So flexibility over rigidity.
Precisely.
Interesting.
And then they go on to question
Yeah.
something that's almost like a sacred cow
Mm.
in the business world.
Yeah.
This idea that every business must
Right.
constantly strive for growth.
Grow bigger. Yeah.
Rework suggests that bigger isn't always better
Hmm.
and that there's real strength in staying small and nimble.
Interesting.
You see this reflected
Yeah.
in the struggles of large companies who are desperately
Right.
trying to recapture that agility.
Makes sense.
The book highlights Southwest Airlines
Okay.
as a prime example. They made a deliberate choice
Okay.
to only operate Boeing 737s.
Uh-huh.
Now, this might seem limiting at first glance,
Okay.
but it leads to streamlined maintenance,
Okay.
lower costs,
Makes sense.
and ultimately a competitive advantage.
So by focusing their efforts,
Yeah.
they're able to
Right.
streamline their operations and make things more efficient.
A powerful lesson
It is.
in the benefits of focus.
Definitely. And it seems like staying focused is a recurring theme here.
It is a thread that runs throughout the book.
Now let's shift gears a little bit
Sure.
and talk about something that I think resonates
Okay.
with a lot of people.
All right.
And that's this idea of workaholism.
Mm,
Fried and Heinemeier Hansson really challenged this
they do.
myth of the heroic overworker,
Uh-huh.
the one who's always putting in crazy hours.
Always on the grind.
Right. They argue that this actually leads to diminished productivity
Yeah.
and, ultimately a lower quality of life.
It's not sustainable in the long run.
It's not.
Right.
And they suggest that
Mm.
by prioritizing reasonable working hours, you actually end up with better focus and better outcomes.
They make this clever analogy to working on a plane
Right.
where you're disconnected from the internet,
Right.
distractions,
Yes.
and you can really get into that deep focused work.
It's a good point because sometimes, when I'm on a plane, I do feel like I can get a lot more done.
It's that enforced period of
Mhm.
uninterrupted time
Exactly.
that allows for that deep focus.
It makes you wonder
Think
if
of-
our always-on culture is actually preventing us
It's a question worth pondering.
from doing our best work.
Absolutely.
It is definitely something to think about.
It is.
Okay, so let's unpack another concept
Right.
that I found really intriguing,
Okay.
and that's embracing constraints as a way to boost creativity.
It sounds counterintuitive,
It does.
but they make a compelling case.
They do.
They draw parallels
Okay.
to artistic forms like haiku and limericks,
Right.
where limitations actually breed ingenuity. Think about Hemingway's famously concise writing style.
Right.
It's a testament to the power of constraints
Okay.
to really refine and hone one's craft.
And they give a real-world example, too.
They do.
With the Airport of the Future project,
Oh, right.
Alaska Airlines. Instead of relying just on blueprints, they use these simple cardboard mock-ups to visualize the design of the airport.
Interesting.
And it led to better collaboration and ultimately a more user-friendly airport.
So by embracing those limitations,
Right.
they were able to come up with
Yeah.
a more creative and effective solution.
It's remarkable how
It is.
resourcefulness can come out
Yeah,
when you're forced to think outside the box.
absolutely.
Speaking of thinking differently,
Okay.
they also talk about the importance of focusing on the epicenter of an idea.
The core.
Yeah, and resisting the urge to get lost in the weeds too early on.
They use a great analogy here.
Okay.
They talk about sketching
Okay.
with a thick Sharpie.
I see.
It prevents you from getting bogged down in tiny details
Right.
before the overall picture is clear.
So start with the bold strokes.
Precisely.
I like that.
And then there's this concept of good enough, which almost feels revolutionary in our culture that's always striving for perfection.
Right.
They encourage us to embrace practicality
Okay.
and to acknowledge that sometimes achieving good enough is actually better
Right.
than chasing an elusive ideal.
That can be paralyzing,
Exactly.
especially when you're trying to get a new venture off the ground.
They give some great examples.
Okay.
Think about the quick turnaround of political campaign ads.
Right.
Sometimes timeliness is more important than polish. Or consider those restaurant makeovers on shows like Kitchen Nightmares.
Right.
Where simplifying an overly ambitious menu
often leads to greater success.
So it's about knowing
Yeah.
when to stop
Exactly.
and say, this is good enough.
Sometimes that's the best approach.
It is a good reminder.
It is.
All right, so now we're going to move into this idea that I think is really fascinating
All right.
and maybe a little bit controversial,
Okay.
and that's teaching as marketing.
Interesting.
So they're basically saying, share your knowledge openly. Don't be afraid to give away your secrets.
Like chefs revealing their recipes.
Exactly. Be like a chef
Interesting.
who's not afraid to publish their cookbook or to host a cooking show.
Right, because they know
Yeah.
that sharing their knowledge
Uh-huh.
doesn't diminish their value. It actually enhances it.
So by teaching others,
Yeah.
you're establishing yourself
Right.
as an expert.
And building trust
Right.
with your audience.
And they give a great example
do.
with the Hoofler type foundry.
Okay.
They've built a loyal following
Uh-huh.
by educating designers
Right.
about typography.
So they're sharing their passion
Exactly.
and their expertise.
And it's drawn people to them.
Precisely.
And another example
Uh-huh.
is Etsy,
Oh.
which empowers its sellers
Right.
through workshops and resources.
So they're creating a community
They are.
around their platform.
It's a really interesting approach.
It is. It
Yeah.
challenges the traditional notion,
It does.
keeping your secrets close to the vest.
Right. And instead it's saying,
Uh-huh.
be open, be generous,
And share your knowledge.
share your knowledge.
The powerful idea.
And speaking of sharing,
Okay.
they also emphasize the importance
Right?
of what they call scratching your own itch,
Mm.
which basically means building products or services
Okay.
that solve problems you personally face.
I see.
So find a problem that bugs you
Uh,
and create a solution for it.
That's how Basecamp was born,
It is.
out of the author's own frustration. with existing project management tools,
Makes sense.
they had a problem. They needed a solution.
Right.
So they built it themselves.
They did.
It's a great example
It is.
of this principle in action.
And it makes you think, what problems am I facing in my own life that could be solved through a product or service?
What are those itches
that
you need to scratch?
Exactly.
Maybe that's the seed of the next great innovation.
It could be.
It's an exciting thought.
It is exciting.
Now get ready for this.
Okay.
They make this provocative statement that long-term is a myth.
Oh, wow.
They're not saying that we shouldn't think about the future, but they argue that fixating on the distant future can be paralyzing.
I see.
And that it's much more effective to focus on the immediate present.
On the now.
On taking action today.
Okay.
They suggest breaking down large, overwhelming tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks. This creates a sense of accomplishment and keeps the momentum going.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by the enormity of a task, you break it down into bite-sized pieces.
Precisely. And focus on taking those first steps.
Makes sense.
It's a powerful strategy for combating procrastination and staying motivated.
I like that.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
In this first part of our rework exploration.
We've gone from debunking the real world myth to embracing constraints, to challenging the growth imperative.
And we've even rethought the whole idea of workaholism.
We have.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
Welcome back to our exploration of rework.
In the last part, we got into some of the author's views.
We did.
On traditional business thinking.
Yeah.
We talked about constraints. And we even redefined workaholism a little bit.
We did.
This time.
We're going to go further into their strategies for productivity, communication.
Okay.
And how to build a really great company culture.
It's fascinating how they approach these topics.
It is.
So let's start with their unique approach to decision-making.
Right.
They advocate for making decisions swiftly.
Okay.
Even if they're not perfect.
I see.
They argue that postponing decisions creates this backlog of unresolved issues.
Right. It's like putting things off just makes them pile up.
Exactly. And it hinders progress.
Right. It's almost like you're creating more work for yourself.
It is. It's like letting dishes pile up in the sink.
Right. The longer you wait, the harder it is to tackle them.
They encourage replacing that phrase.
Oh, okay.
Let's think about it with let's decide on it.
Interesting.
It's a subtle shift in language, but it emphasizes commitment.
To action.
Exactly.
I like that. They highlight how accumulating choices creates a sense of inertia.
It's like you get stuck.
You do. It's like trying to push a car that's stuck in mud.
The more you delay, the harder it gets.
Precisely.
And they identify interruptions as the ultimate productivity killer.
The archenemy of focus.
They say that to do really meaningful work, you need extended periods of uninterrupted time.
They compare it to reaching REM sleep. You can't just jump into that restorative state.
Right. You need that uninterrupted rest.
Exactly. And similarly, reaching that flow state where you're completely immersed in a task requires dedicated blocks of time.
Free from distraction.
Precisely.
They bring up that analogy of working on an airplane again.
Right.
Where you're detached from the digital world.
And you can really dive deep
into your...
It's a compelling argument.
It is.
For creating those pockets of uninterrupted time.
In our lives.
Yeah.
Which is hard.
It is a challenge.
It's getting harder and harder.
Especially in our hyper-connected world.
And this leads us to their critique of meetings.
Oh, yes.
Which they often see as a huge waste of time and resources.
They do the math and illustrate this point with a striking calculation. For every hour-long meeting with 10 participants, you're essentially sacrificing 10 hours of potential individual productivity.
That's a good point.
It makes you reconsider every meeting.
That lands in your inbox.
Doesn't it?
It really does.
They encourage seeking what they call judo solutions.
Judo solutions.
Approaches that deliver maximum impact with minimal effort.
I like that.
So instead of brute forcing your way through a problem, you find a more elegant and efficient solution.
So like using leverage.
Precisely.
Instead of just brute force.
It's about working smarter, not harder.
Okay.
They give the example of taking the elevator to the top of a building for a panoramic view.
Right.
Instead of hiking up a mountain.
It's a much more efficient way
it is
to get to the same outcome.
They also provide a concrete example with those quick and dirty political campaign ads. When a critical issue arises, politicians often air ads the very next day.
Right. They don't wait.
We prioritize speed over polish.
Because they know that timing is everything.
Exactly. It's a great example of their good enough philosophy.
Which we talked about before.
Yes. They advocate for getting things out there as soon as they're functional, rather than waiting for them to be perfect.
So don't let perfection be the enemy of good.
Exactly. Launch early, iterate frequently, and get your work into the hands of users.
As quickly as possible.
That's where you get the real valuable feedback.
Right, for the people who are actually going to be using it.
It's about prioritizing momentum over perfection.
Okay, and they have this concept that they call, don't be a hero.
It's a powerful concept.
What does that mean?
It's about recognizing when to abandon a task or project that's just not working.
Even if you've put in...
Right, even if you've invested significant time and energy.
So sometimes it's better to...
It is. Sometimes it's wiser to cut your losses.
And move on.
Move on.
Than to keep pouring resources into something that's not working.
Exactly. It's a tough lesson.
It is, because we often feel like we need to see things through
to completion.
To the very end.
Even when it's no longer serving us.
Right.
It's a valuable lesson, though.
It is.
And they also talk about this tendency we have to underestimate how long things will actually take.
We all do that.
Especially when it comes to large projects.
Right.
They cite examples like Boston's Big Dig, the highway project, and the Denver International Airport.
Right. Those were notorious.
They were both.
For going way over budget.
And scheduled.
Taking much longer than expected.
They underscore the challenge of accurately predicting timelines.
Especially for those kinds of...
those massive...
huge projects. So what do they suggest we do about it?
Well, they recommend breaking down those large tasks into smaller, more manageable segments.
Like we talked about before.
Exactly. It makes it easier to estimate timelines.
Right.
And to track progress.
Makes sense.
They also suggest prioritizing visually instead of assigning numerical values.
I see.
Or labels to tasks.
So instead of saying this is a priority 1, this is a priority 2,
exactly.
You just visually arrange them.
Yeah, in order of importance.
By how important they are.
Precisely. It helps you to focus on the most critical tasks.
On that moment.
At any given time. Rather than getting bogged down by a long list.
Of to-dos.
Of to-dos.
That might not all be that important.
Exactly.
Now let's move on to their perspective on customer service. This is where their say-no philosophy really comes into play.
They encourage businesses to be very selective about which customer requests
they accommodate.
They argue that it's perfectly acceptable to decline requests that don't align with your core values.
Or your product vision.
Exactly. It's about protecting your vision and ensuring that your product stays true.
To its purpose.
To its intended purpose.
And they give an example of ING Direct, which is a bank that's known for being really streamlined.
Very straightforward.
In their approach.
They've achieved success by saying no
to a lot of things.
To requests that would complicate their operations.
So they're not trying to be everything to everyone.
They're focused on what they do well.
It's about having the courage to stand by your convictions.
Even if it means turning away potential business.
Sometimes you got to say no.
Sometimes you do.
And they also stress the importance of owning your mistakes.
Yes, transparency.
Transparency and addressing problems directly.
Right, rather than trying
to hide them.
To sweep them under the rug.
They contradict response to the Valdez oil spill, which was disastrous.
It was a PR nightmare.
With Ashland Oil's response to a similar incident, Ashland's chairman immediately took responsibility. He visited the affected area.
Right.
And he communicated openly with the public.
So they were proactive.
They were.
And transparent.
And it actually helped to mitigate
the
damage to their reputation.
It's a powerful lesson.
It is.
In crisis management.
It shows that honesty and accountability
can go a long way.
Can really go a long way.
They also advocate for empowering all team members to interact directly with customers.
So break down those barriers.
Exactly.
Between departments.
Let everyone have a voice.
And they even recommend sending people home at 5 p.m.
It's radical.
It is.
But they argue that reasonable working hours lead to better focus.
And more productivity.
Exactly.
It's a refreshing perspective.
It is.
In a world that often glorifies overwork.
They're challenging.
They are.
It's that hustle culture.
And they're saying that sometimes the best way to get more done is to actually work less.
It's about quality.
It is. Over quantity.
Oh. Okay. Now, let's talk about their insights on building a really strong company culture.
They emphasize that you can't just manufacture culture.
Right. It has to be.
It has to be genuine.
Authentic.
It has to come from within.
So it's not something you can just impose.
You can't just write it down on a piece of paper and say, this is our culture.
It has to develop organically.
Exactly.
Through consistent behaviors and shared values.
They make this great analogy between authentic culture and patina.
Patina.
That rich layered finish that develops on surfaces.
Over time.
I see.
Through use and exposure.
So it's like the character that develops.
That emerges through experience as opposed to paint.
Right, which is just a surface layer.
A superficial coating.
And they believe in fostering trust.
Absolutely.
Autonomy and responsibility.
Empowering employees.
To do their best work.
Exactly. They envision what they call a rock star environment.
Rock star environment.
A space where talent can flourish. And individuals feel empowered.
To reach their full potential.
Precisely.
And this leads to their critique of excessive rules.
Oh, yes.
And policies.
They see those as organizational scar tissue.
Organizational scar tissue, that's a good one.
It's a vivid image.
It is.
They argue that policies often arise from overreactions.
To isolated incidents.
Exactly. So instead of addressing the root cause of the problem,
you just create.
You slap a Band-Aid on it.
A Band-Aid.
In the form of a policy.
And they say that that creates unnecessary bureaucracy. And it stifles
and hinders
innovation.
So instead of having all these rules, they advocate for a more flexible,
a more trusting approach. Where you empower employees
to make decisions,
to take ownership,
and to be responsible.
Precisely.
For their own work.
They also caution against using inflammatory language. Like need. And can't. They argue that these words often conceal assumptions and create a sense of artificial urgency.
So it's about being more mindful of the language that we use.
And the impact it has.
On others.
Exactly.
And we're back for the final part of our Rework Deep Dive.
We've covered a lot of ground. We have from productivity to customer service to company culture.
Right.
This time we'll tackle competition. Finding your niche.
All right.
And building something truly great.
So to kick things off, let's address the elephant in the room.
Competition.
Competition, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Now, Fried and Hansson,
they
have a rather unique take on this. They urge us to basically ignore it.
Ignore competition.
Ignore it, that's right.
That's definitely not what you typically hear.
No, it goes against the conventional wisdom.
So why do they say that?
Well, they argue that focusing too much on your rivals can become an unhealthy obsession.
I see.
It can create stress.
Right.
And it can distract you.
From what really matters.
Exactly, from your customers and from your craft.
And they also point out that the competitive landscape is always changing.
It's a moving target.
So instead of trying to keep up with the competition,
they suggest finding your unique angle.
Your differentiator.
Your purple cow, as they call it.
Purple cow.
It's a memorable image.
It is.
It's about standing out.
From the crowd.
Exactly.
And they give the example of fixed gear bicycles.
Oh, right.
Which went against the trend.
They did at the time.
Of multi-gear high-tech bike.
It was all about simplicity.
And finding an audience to use that.
They tapped into a niche that was underserved.
So it's about identifying those unmet needs.
And catering to them.
And they even encourage picking a fight.
Picking a fight.
But not necessarily with a specific competitor.
Right, not in a literal sense.
More like...
It's about challenging an entire industry.
Or a prevailing assumption.
Exactly like Dyson did.
With the Airblade.
Airblade, right?
Which they positioned as a better alternative.
To those awful hand dryers.
Yeah, the ones that never really dry your hands. So it's about disrupting the status quo.
And doing it confidently.
And now, for something that might seem a little counterintuitive.
Okay.
Don't copy.
Interesting.
So we're often told to learn from our competitors.
To emulate success.
Right. But they're saying don't copy.
They argue that copying leads to mediocrity.
I see.
It prevents you from developing your own
style.
Your own unique identity. Your authentic voice.
They say to seek inspiration from a variety of sources.
Not just within your industry?
Like a musician. Who draws inspiration from literature.
Or a chef who experiments with techniques from different cultures.
It's about cross-pollination of ideas.
Leading to something truly original.
I like that.
They also offer this interesting perspective on underdoing the competition.
Underdoing.
So instead of trying to outdo your rivals.
In every single
area.
They suggest finding a few key areas.
Okay, where you can really excel.
Focus on your strengths.
Exactly.
So like a restaurant.
Yeah.
That specializes in a specific type of cuisine.
Or a clothing brand.
Right.
That focuses on a particular niche.
It's about differentiation.
It is.
Not trying to be all things.
To all people.
To all people.
All right, now let's talk about building a lasting legacy.
Legacy, that's a big word.
It is, but they break it down into a simple exercise.
Right.
They ask us to imagine press releasing our company.
Press releasing.
So as if you had to summarize
the essence of your business
in a single compelling announcement.
What would it say?
What would be the headline?
It's about identifying your core values.
Proposition.
And the impact you want to make.
On the world.
It's like your elevator pitch.
For the universe.
For the universe, I love that.
They also advocate for cultivating a culture of teaching and sharing knowledge.
Like those chefs.
Exactly like chefs.
Who share their recipes.
It's about contributing to the community.
And fostering collaboration.
And they remind us of this idea that long-term is a myth.
Right, we talked about that before.
We did, and it's worth repeating because it's such
a powerful concept.
Powerful concept.
So they're encouraging us
to focus
on making progress today.
On the present moment.
On those small victories.
Because those small wins add up over time.
So it's a marathon.
It is.
Not a sprint.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We've explored some really unconventional ideas.
As promised. Here's that 10-point summary.
Okay.
To help you remember
the
key takeaways from Rework.
I'm ready.
Number 1, ignore the real-world myth.
Okay.
And embrace constraints.
To spark creativity.
2, ditch rigid long-term planning. And prioritize flexibility.
3,
question the growth imperative. 4, reject workaholism.
5,
begin with the core of your idea.
6,
embrace good enough solutions.
7,
launch early and iterate often.
8,
share your expertise openly.
9,
hire only when absolutely necessary.
10.
Cultivate a culture of trust and autonomy.
It's a great list.
We hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas.
And inspired you.
To approach your work with a fresh perspective.
Until next time.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep creating.